This is Sonic Ventures, a podcast celebrating the concept album format with Robert Goebel and Joël Tibbetts.
Sonic Ventures is an evolving series of discussions that explore concept albums from a variety of artists and genres. Our intent here is to have celebratory conversations of our personal experiences with selected works and the issues and themes surrounding concept albums.
Sometimes, we will be treading familiar waters concerning music interpretation and creation. Other times, we will venture into different places of thought, emotion, and expression. We invite you to join us on our sonic venture.
Rob here. Welcome to our Ep.3 discussion where Joël and I tackle the granddaddy of concept album genres, the veritable rock opera. This conversation was recorded October 22nd, 2021. This was a great discussion, and what I like most about it was in keeping with our kitchen table aesthetic, we were definitely challenged by our domestic environment, meaning we had lots of barking dogs and kids playing in the street and neighbors and planes and all kinds of really fun domestic noise situations that had us scrambling to accommodate them while keeping the discussion going and keeping things, the red recording light on, basically. So we did pretty good. There's a couple of select edits there, but nothing too jarring, but definitely in keeping with our kitchen table aesthetic. So domesticity is alive and well in the Sonic Venture podcast. The other thing I really like about this discussion is that you can tell we're getting better at it. And by better, I just mean that we are not struggling as much to find language with which we can share our thoughts and experiences. We're definitely benefiting from the previous discussions that we've had. We're building this sort of depository of shared experiences and thoughts, and we both get to access that as we go forward with each and every discussion. So the idea of the podcast being a series of discussions is starting to take shape and form, and for me on this side of the mic, I can definitely feel that happening during the discussions. So that's really exciting, and it's part of developing a deeper relationship with Joël and building on our friendship, but also really exciting because we really get deeper and deeper as we go forward into the topics for discussion. So very, very exciting stuff. Episode 3. Hope you enjoy it. Let me make sure the phone is off.
Yes, please.
And I'm actually, though I'm going to keep it, I was going to keep it here for sneaky reference, but I found so far that it doesn't necessarily, I haven't been able to work in having an active screen as
Right.
part of the discussion tonight. So I'm still not sure exactly how I feel about that.
Right.
But it's here just in case I need to look something up.
It's interesting that you say that, because I was thinking about that too, and I've just decided that I will say I don't know, and I'll look into it for next time.
Yeah, there we go.
Just leave it at that. I'm just going to go with I'm ignorant at this time, or I can't remember.
Yeah,
and in that regard, just stay in the conversation and not get pulled out. But please feel free to Google something.
Yeah, if I need to. It's like I said, I haven't. I think I tried last time. There was something I tried to quickly look up, I remember sort of hesitating
Right.
and worrying about whether it was a natural moment and whether you'd be able to tell listening to the conversation. It's like, oh, that guy he's Googling. I can tell just by the, just by the tone of silence or something. Yeah.
It's the Google pause.
The Google pause. Exactly.
So, rock operas.
Rock operas.
One of the, a few of what I think you referred to as an elephant in the room
Right.
of what we're doing in terms of talking about concept albums. I think there's a lot of places to go.
Yeah.
And a lot of places I don't even know that we may end up in with this way of referring to approaching to putting something together as a rock opera.
Right. It's when you think of concept albums, it's one of those, it either is the second sort of word or sort of idea of that's paired with concept album, if not the first, idea that then leads to concept album. Like they're related. They're one's a version of the other or a subset of the other. But certainly in the canon of concept albums as a category or a subcategory or a starting point,
Right.
rock operas figure pretty primary.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you can acknowledge that primary or seminal position, and still yet not quite know what that is.
Right.
And still not be certain about what a rock opera is or isn't or should be or like. But we have a fairly immediate idea of this. There is a thing called rock opera.
Yeah. And it carries that concept album baggage of ambiguity as well. So when we talked about talking about this, there was a very particular question that I had for you that came to mind.
Okay.
And very simply, I wanted to ask you, before we get into the idea of a rock opera, when you hear the word opera, what comes to mind for you? What do you see? What do you think? What do you even feel about that designation of opera?
Now, when you ask that, do you ask that in relationship to rock opera or just what opera means to me?
On its own, just opera.
Right. Well, yeah. So we're going there. Yeah. As I was preparing for the discussion, you can't not start there as well. It's like, and as you start going back, I have to acknowledge that for me, opera exists, or at least sort of as an artistically sort of what would be the best word? Sort of an achieved level of artistry in the history of the classical Western music sort of arc. Right. So that everything that classical Western classical music, where it came from and what it went through its iterations and development, that it produced some high forms, and high being a prejudicial word, but with its own baggage. But it produced some high or idealized forms of music, of which opera and symphony are sort of these big granddaddies in sort of that tradition. So opera to me embodies everything that was sort of idealized in the classical music canon, but that then included storytelling and included the aesthetic of that classical time period.
Right.
So that it embodied costumes and art, and it was like their big package. So opera was like the full meal deal of classicism,
I think that's a good way to put it.
The full meal deal, and separate from symphony, which was the full musical, sort of like the best of the musical only form,
right?
Sort of, or like the again the full meal deal,
right?
Of that. So opera to me was always sort of this mythical, sort of penultimate point of the development of Western classical music, and sort of covering all the genres of entertainment or spectacle or music in its intertwined entirety at that point. So that's what opera meant to me growing up. It was this sort of idealized, full of the virtues of classical, the Western classical music tradition, as sort of like a penultimate achievement point.
Yeah,
that was my first sort of understanding of what opera was.
Well, it's interesting that you've put it that way, because you certainly have given a very broad, even though generalized assessment of it, because my relationship with it has been largely influenced by my education, music education. And when I had basically finished that education, my kind of generalized assessment of opera was that it was like it demonstrated a certain idealized health of the society. If this society can make an opera, there must be a lot of other things that are going on that are supposedly going well. So again, that's an incredible generalization, and it's very specific, very marginalized view of a health of a society or even art making. But for me, at one point, opera was the reason why you achieve opera was to achieve the production of an opera was because it was, like you said, this penultimate achievement, and therefore the basis of what is required to have things in a society working are there. I actually had some of that view come from when I heard about when Winston Churchill during the Second World War was discussing the finances of Great Britain and where they're going to put money and how they're going to allocate resources to fight in this war. And the treasurer at the time, whose name I can't remember right now, had said, well, we ought to take money away from the arts. And Churchill's response was, well, what are we fighting for? If we take that away, and how I interpreted that, if we take that away, we're taking away one of the reasons why we're fighting. So if you take it away while you're fighting, people don't have access to it. They don't see it. They don't see, maybe, I'm speculating Churchill's views, they don't see the full compass of
why we're in this fight.
Why we're in this fight, and even why why we exist, how we're living our lives. But I think the way that you've talked about, it being a full meal deal for opera, as opera being a full meal deal on a creative level of those societies at that time, those times, I think that's actually a nice, simple bow to designate to opera.
Well, and I like that idea of because within civilizations and European civilizations and European cultures, opera and the ability to sort of get to that level was an aspiration, right?
Yeah.
So you have in the development of opera as a form through its history, sort of different countries being sort of the primacy of the art at that point in time, sort of being the dominant or the ideal through which others aspired and followed and tried to display. So you have, you have Italian, you have
with that. That's actually where it started, was in Italy.
That's right.
Is it, and like you said, it moved quickly. So if they have it, we better have it too.
Yeah, we got to get it. So the French got on it, the Germans got on it. The British got on it at some point, and there were you can look it up in a textbook. There were definitely 4 or 5, or the Russians got on it. Or 6 or 7 sort of nationalities that were sort of had their opera movements and a whole set of tenets and dogmas as part of that, and but all still in the tradition of Western classical music.
Right. And perhaps maybe to add to that, Western art making.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's got everything. It's got theater, it has visual art, it's got the music component. It also has, the actual conceptual and lyrical material comes from poetry and prose, so it touches on all the big art classes, or classifications,
and you can't separate religion from it either. In the sense that as sort of Europe came into the Western civilization that we understand, you have where in architecture, the building of a cathedral, where a city, a town, a country, a nation would be judged on its ability to build a beautiful cathedral, and all the resources that went into those arts, the building arts and the design arts that to sort of prop that up. And for me, part of opera, as a form, or as a high art form initially, serious opera, that as it seemed to me to come from that same tradition, that there was by loading it with pomp, and by loading it up with sort of the best of everything, that it kept it both, it kept it more sacred than secular, right? So it and more aristocratic than common, right?
Well, so, and you just think about the economic implications of it.
Sure.
I mean, I worked for Vancouver Opera for almost 2 years.
Okay.
And there was a couple of reasons how I ended up there, but one of them was an intentional need to learn something more about how you do something like this. How do you organize that? But one thing that really surprised me, even though I already knew there were people who are really passionate about opera, they deeply love it, they deeply care for it, but how it was such a status symbol that if you say that you work for the opera, there's all of a sudden there's this kind of glow that appears around you, or there's even areas of the possibility for connecting with people simply because you say that. And so, as you mentioned, there's the religious elements to it. There's very political, exceedingly political.
Yeah.
But then also relates right back to even class and status.
Yeah.
It's right there, right away. And so when I would tell people that I worked for the opera, and they knew that I was a composer, and a musician, there was a few times where somebody said, like, you're writing an opera. And I said, no, I work in fundraising for the opera. But it didn't diminish anything, or at least they made it look like I hadn't slipped
Sure.
in their appearance.
Right. I'm a part-time fundraiser, and I work the coat check at the opera. Oh.
They're very nice coats.
Yeah.
Very, very heavy.
Yeah.
Good material.
Yeah. The tickets you get are a really nice quality paper.
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah, and the whole mood around opera and the whole tradition around. That's why I wanted to ask you that question.
Yeah,
Because I have spoken to a few people who will say how they respect opera, but they have no idea about. They don't know any operas.
Sure.
They don't listen to them. They actually don't want to listen to them, but they really respect it simply because it looks like a huge undertaking, and it's got something of a rich and dynamic history.
Also, having a classical education, classical music education, my thoughts about opera were established long before. And just through sort of general scholastic music education, we, in Canada, we had our little modules in elementary school where they taught us about the orchestra and classical music and that kind of thing.
I didn't have that.
Well,
I went into band class to get that.
really?
Yeah, we didn't have that.
You didn't have that in elementary
No,
school?
no.
Wow. No, we actually went to the symphony in elementary school.
Oh, wow.
Like when I was really young, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4.
Wow.
Yeah. That was
You had some dollars flowing there in the
Yeah.
school you were at.
Wally.
Well, then you
Yeah.
spent all the money I didn't get any access to.
Yeah, no, it was there was definitely trips to symphony. There was a program that you would come in, and they would the idea of introducing kids to music and introducing kids to in particular classical music and the instruments of the orchestra was a module of something. Now, I think back, our music teacher at my original elementary school was a classical opera singer. So whether she had some extra connections as part of that.
Yeah, that must have been it.
Yeah.
We didn't have that.
She was an amazing woman whose name I'm suddenly not remembering. But one of the neat things I remember about her, just as a neat little story for the middle of our discussion here, is her teeth were cracked like china. Like, when you see like fine white china develop cracks, and it's got all these cracks in it. Well, like all her teeth had these like fine cracks in them that you could see. And she attributed those to sucking on lemons.
Wow.
As some sort of thing before she sang.
Wow.
Made sense to me as a 6-year-old or 7-year-old. She might have been full of it. She might have just had, bad dental hygiene when she was younger. I'm not sure, but real neat lady. I remember her very fondly. So I definitely developed sort of this idea that symphony and opera were big, important things.
Right.
And probably, I didn't think of this, but probably reinforced by the fact that my first instrument, as I think you know, was accordion. And it specifically because it was, someone came door to door to the house, knocking on doors as a music lesson salesman and with an accordion in a suitcase. And, at 5 or 6 years old, I was signed up for accordion lessons, and accordions were much cheaper than to buy a piano if you didn't have a piano at those times. So I played the accordion, but back in the day, from when I was an accordion player, that instrument in the 70s was still quite a big instrument, particularly in Vancouver, the urban population of Vancouver, where we had a lot of ethnic communities where accordion was like one of their big instruments. So we had a big Italian community, but any European community seemed to have their tradition with the accordion. And every year there was a big music festival where all the accordion students across the general would compete. And, we're talking thousands of kids competing. Yes. They'd rent the Hotel Vancouver and the ballrooms and everything. And for a whole weekend, there would be these competitions, including these massive accordion bands. And, we'd have like 40 kids in a band structured like an orchestra, where they had pieces arranged for us, with like first violin, second violin, just all distributed to accordion players. And the year that I remember most from that festival was kind of the climax of that time period for me. We did Marriage of Figaro as our big accordion band, and that was my first taste of opera, the music of an opera, and that was sort of posited as an ideal to a lowly accordion band. It wasn't 40 people playing a polka. It was 40 people playing Mozart, and right. and that set my imagination and desire on fire for opera. So I was so interested in and wanting to experience opera as I got older, that when I had the chance, you probably remember they had student tickets that they through universities and stuff that they would sell really cheap,
right?
But really primo tickets.
They still do.
Yeah, which so you sometimes had to have a bit of a connection to get it. It wasn't because the way they distributed them was a little different. I think they distributed them through people, so there was like a certain amount of tickets that were, say, allocated to different colleges or different places. But I was really lucky to get for about 2 or 3 years a run of tickets for the season to be able to see several full seasons of the Vancouver Opera. Right. And man, I loved it. I loved it for what it was. Right. And I loved it. It just felt like, when you talked about earlier about this sort of the way when you told people you work for the opera and how they responded. Yeah. Well, I felt that way about myself just being in the audience, like, oh my God, I am here. Right. And I can, remember telling someone about, we went to the opera the other day, and you got the same kind of went to the opera, as if it was something that was hard to do, Yeah. And, the tickets were like, I don't know, they were like $20 or something. It was like crazy cheap for like,
nosebleeds.
No, eighth row center.
Oh, wow.
Like amazing tickets. And not on the alternate performance dates, like prime stuff. It was just amazing. And I loved everything about it, It I really celebrated sort of my arrival there, but in the audience. And my academic understanding of opera came later. Right. But for me, as a lover of music, it couldn't have surpassed my expectations any further than it did. Like it was, it met them, and was everything I thought it would be. That this music performed, and having these seats where you're so close. Yeah. It was awesome. So. Wow. I really developed a real love for what I saw and experienced there. Yeah. And that, that sort of followed me through, but my understanding of opera definitely changed as I grew more educated to it. Mm-hmm. And it's something today I still really like. Mm-hmm. My wife and I, a couple years, got tickets to a couple of seasons, but our budget can't support that at the moment. So. Right. We haven't done that for maybe 10 years, but I really I have a real love for it as a form, and I'm relatively able to bring kind of a naivete to watching it still. Like I can kind of separate my academic understanding of it and just sort of take it in as a visceral thing.
Right. You get carried up in the experience.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Which I'm really pleased with. So
yeah. So then how does that inform or relate to your views on rock operas, or what they are and how they are?
Yeah, well, that's for me. It was a twofold sort of connection. Mm-hmm. The one being, I understood we'll call it the conceit of the title, rock opera, sort of trying to give gravitas, to and to this idea that, I mean, just the two words together, rock opera, right? I know what rock is, you know, and I know what opera is. And so if you go put them together, you've got rock opera. I know what that is, you know, and it just sort of in a sense, without knowing what it is, I know what it is. So when my very first time I heard rock opera as a thing was when someone was describing Jesus Christ Superstar to me. Yeah, you know, and the history of that. You know, you couldn't watch or learn about that without immediately getting into the sort of tension between the idea that you could have something called an opera connected to something that was rock, right? So even within the very earliest introduction of that, you know, it was already sort of rock opera tension asterisks debate. It was all there. Yeah. But for me, it just meant sort of like big story, you know, big. Yeah. You know, sort of in my simple, more child understanding of it. And I didn't have a prejudice for what made an opera properly an opera, you know, even though I understood an opera as something of a Western music tradition. Right. I didn't know that meant that there couldn't be something called a rock opera. So it just made sense. Yeah, it didn't seem to be treading on anyone's feet. It didn't seem to be doing any wrong by putting them together. Yeah. Because it's interesting you say that, because the first time I remember encountering the term rock opera was when it was associated with Tommy and then The Wall. But I didn't have any, I actually thought it was exciting. Yeah. Rock opera, that sounds great. It sounds huge. It sounds powerful. It sounds like it has a lot of depth, and it's long, and it's, as we have talked about, we're going to keep talking about, it sounds like a great journey. Yeah. Rock opera. Yeah. Right? And so what you've said about how you do have you have backgrounds in both opera and rock, and it's the same thing for me. It's been very interesting to, thinking about doing this, having this conversation, to just try to revisit what my impression of rock opera is. And one of the things that I found really interesting is I haven't thought about it. Even though we talked about doing a concept album, we started doing concept albums, and sure, it's come up, but up until that point, I haven't been thinking about rock operas. I haven't been investing myself in what are they and what they should be. Right. And so even the thinking about, like, what is rock opera supposed to be? You know, I did a little bit of my research online, and and I listened to some stuff that's, you know, classically usually referred to as a rock opera, like Tommy, Jesus Christ Superstar, The Wall. And
there was two things that have come up for me about rock opera. But before I mention them, the idea of character, the idea of a person or a protagonist, and how you're delving into their story or their problems, seems to me to be the area where I saw a lot of agreement for the use of rock opera.
Right.
That if it's about characters, and characters are actually speaking from where they are, then perhaps then the use of the word opera is okay, like it's appropriate. But then of course the other argument comes up as, well, maybe it's just a musical. So for me, the idea of a rock opera, where I am right now with it, is more about coming from that place of character, is what really, for me, brings the two together. And so the two areas that I've come to when thinking about this, one of them, you actually kind of mentioned it earlier before, is high art and low art,
right,
which I think is from some of the the historical criticisms of things being called rock operas. I could feel that tension. Opera is high, rock is low. And so I spent a bit of time just sitting with that and contemplating that, and how I've never liked that kind of way of referring to art at all, as whether it's high or low. I mean, we could just talk about the historical problems with that forever.
Sure.
And maybe we'll get to some of them. I don't know if we'll get to them in this podcast or another one, but I think even the idea of high and low is very interesting to me. And in reflecting on that with rock opera, it reminded me of a moment I had when I was working for the opera. So this person was just telling me how they didn't think much of newer operas. They thought that they were beneath notice. But the moment I told this person that I was a composer, they started to listen to me differently.
Okay.
And so I was just reliving this whole relationship between high and low art. And I kind of went down memory lane a little bit with these moments I've had with people. And what it brought me to was this commonality between opera and rock that I found really exciting. And what it basically is that in rock music, as in opera, I think there's an acknowledgement of the majesty of song. So in opera, you have all the staging, you have the theatrical element, you have the poetry, you have the prose, you have the scale of, you're in a huge theater, you have the orchestra, you have all these people involved, it takes months of rehearsal, there's all these issues to solve, because you're building a context for song to exist. So whether you want to talk about arias or
librettos.
Thank you, librettos. This is about songs. Yeah. It's about a human being singing. Could be more than one, but just to keep it really simple, it's about a human being singing. And if you have that human being singing out on the street with nothing other than their voice, and then you compare it to opera staging and there's an aria happening, the commonality is the song. But with an opera, I feel that all of that investment of energy and time and the theatrics and the orchestra and all of that is that you are creating a context for the song to inhabit. And by doing that, it's like you're creating an ecosystem.
Sure.
And so the song suddenly is able to be seen differently. It's able to influence things differently. It has a kind of amplification that it wouldn't have in the same respect if it's a person just singing on the street.
Right.
So the word amplifier immediately.
Yeah, there we go.
Rock is this, in a sense, I mean, I guess you could say this about all forms of music, but rock has its own way of creating an ecosystem and a context.
Right.
Amplification and attitude and energy. And so song is about, it's a very human thing, but I think it's also a very, very much a creature thing, right? Here I am in this place. I'm in the world, and how I relate to it and how it relates to me. The thing about song, I think, for human beings, a lot of the time, I mean, my ideas have changed now and then, but I feel that song is very primal. Whether you throw lyrics on it or not, there's that, the use of melody is very, it has this beautiful abstraction about it. And you pair that with words, you pair that with these sounds that we equate meaning with, song becomes huge. Song becomes more than human. It becomes, if you will, cosmic. It becomes not universal. Cosmic is a better word. Universal doesn't quite sit well with me right now, but it has an outreach that doesn't happen, I think, in any other way for human beings.
Sure.
So by bringing rock and opera together, one way that I was thinking about it is that you are intensifying a celebration and recognition of song.
Right. Well, I think when you described something earlier, the majesty, when you used the word majesty, you know, it's a reason why we use the word operatic as a descriptor.
Yeah.
You know, because operatic, it does describe that quality of majesty and you know, sort of high intensity, majestic, and in the opera that you're talking about, part of and we talked earlier about sort of the, you know, all these different idealized or penultimate forms of art coming together, from, you know, acting and set design to you know, designing the staging and the music and the lighting and all the things that sort of are part of, those are all part of opera, because the opera exists in its presentation on a stage in a place, right? That is the opera. Rock music and a rock opera, its fundamental form is the album, right? That's where it exists.
Yeah.
That's what makes a rock opera initially in its genesis. You know, there are rock operas that were then staged as operas, but the very first rock operas as recording forms, they took that idea of the penultimate achievement in the arts that opera was meant to represent, and paired that with rock to say, this is our penultimate achievement. You know, this is so we're taking the majesty and the form that we have, right, which is the album, and we're pairing it with this music that's rock. And yet you're right that the focus on that, on songs and is even more obvious in the album format, because that's what you got, right?
Yeah.
But that pairing is itself a matter of declaration, right? So in some ways, the ambition of the achievement or the self-declaration of this is a rock opera versus this is an album that has a story to it with a bunch of songs, if you don't call it a rock opera, it's not a rock opera. Or if someone calls it a rock opera,
right,
it is a rock opera, even if you don't call it a rock opera. Like, there's sort of a self-declaration both from a listener and or from the performer or the composer or but there's an act of that declaration there that says this concept of opera and this concept of rock and album, these paired together in this moment, this is a rock opera. And I think for you and I, that was an easy concept to grasp. Right?
Yeah, it was exciting.
It was exciting because rock music to us already was no surprise that it was full of majesty. Yeah. Right? For our grandparents, and those that were born, sort of the World War I generation of adults that grew up through and into the World War II, that then had kids, part of the post-war boom. They were still sort of stuck in that opera traditional sense of opera was something very specific. Yeah. And the penultimate of music and of all these other arts residing in opera were exclusive, right? They couldn't reside elsewhere. Yeah. And for me, the genesis of rock opera and why it sort of was as much a political, sociological sort of necessity of that generation in post-war Britain, growing up through years of austerity, being burdened with the artifacts of classical, the classical era, that was sort of lauded all through, even into the early part of the 20th century, right up to the middle of the 20th century, and trying to find a way to reconcile to those what their contribution and participation in culture was, because there was I think the idea I have is that with especially with World War II, the schism and that sort of interrupted the arc of cultural development in sort of Europe as a sort of a continuous arc, where we really had a generation that was disconnected and was never going to be able to get onto that arc and continue it as part of it, right? So they were estranged from it. It was a historical artifact, right? But that still weighed heavy on as a burden that dismissed a lot of what post-war youth were living. Right. Yeah. So when for me, rock opera also really my own enjoyment of it was with Tommy, and all my understanding and all the reading I did at the time, there was such an effort by both Pete Townsend, but also the people around him, and we'll call it rock or new rock establishment or new music sort of people, to try and they were actually trying to give validity to this idea that this music young people were playing could have an achievement akin to a level of an opera. Yeah. So and you read some of those articles and you can really see the tension and what the mission of to sort of prop up Townsend and young people's music, popular music, as legitimate. It's like to legitimize it. And and that's a real interesting word to use
for bringing those two, bringing rock and opera together is to
Right.
legitimize
yeah.
rock,
Yeah.
right? We could and by extension, not even by extension, concept albums as well.
Mm-hmm.
That devoting a full album to a very particular node or pinpoint of an idea, and then to really go inside it,
Right.
to really open it up. It's what opera does, right?
Sure.
When Wagner was at his height, his whole ambition, which he achieved, was to actually create the early film theater before that was really a thing, where you go into the theater to watch the opera and all the lighting is gone around you except what's on stage.
Sure.
The orchestra, he designed it so the orchestra was underneath the stage, so you don't even see them. So you are just totally focused on that experience, and you're able to fully invest yourself in it. So if you create something that you feel you really want people to invest themselves in, I think legitimizing it, to state that, this is worth giving your time and attention to this. No, I don't want to. It's not as good as this, or it's not this, or it's not that. I don't want that.
Right.
Well, you need to listen to this, right? And I'm not saying that that's literally why you would put the word opera there. I think what you're saying about not only legitimizing it, but saying it's an achievement, right? Because what do young people often want from their parents is to recognize that they've done something. I'm here. Look what I did.
Sure.
So young people talking to that society, that the older parents and the other older people of that society, saying, look, we achieved this, or we did this. This is a value. This has meaning. I think what you're saying has a great deal to do with that that affectation, or that titling of rock opera.
Yeah, and that's not, so I think, and you're right, as I stumble around here, going back to Your Majesty, it's really, it's not, we're not trying to say that this is the equivalent achievement to an opera.
Yeah, no.
But it's the idea of what was in what operatic and what the opera sort of represented from that sort of majesty song perspective, and pairing it with rock, to legitimize it, and the equivocation just comes from, this is a thing, we're doing something. It's not a ditty. It's not a throwaway. It's not a single.
It's not a ditty. That's good.
It's not a ditty, right?
Yeah.
It's not a pub song. It's not a little. There were a lot of ditties and sort of whimsy, right? In sort of like in the sort of early part of the 20th century. There was a lot of sort of just.
Well, and I think that also one of the things I learned from working for the opera and getting to know the production people, and realizing how many problems you have to overcome, and how even the night before you're going to have the show, and in one case I know of on the day of, there is no other solution than to get it done.
Right.
If this doesn't happen, this opera will be just considered to be by lots of people a failure. And then after that, what's going to happen to the image of the company?
Right.
The
failures cascade.
Yeah, right.
Like if it's all on the line.
So then why then that can also be attributed, I think, to the passionate fervor for making a rock opera, right? No, we're not just going to, like punk, the 3-chord, I'm going to state how I feel with as little as I have, as opposed to I'm going to find what I need. I'm going to get more. I'm going to acquire the resources and the people to make this happen. I'm going to invest myself in something that is grandiose.
Sure.
Even though perhaps the society or what I have tells me, no, you can't.
Yeah.
It's not something for you. No, I'm going to go ahead and make it happen. And I think that, which goes with everything I've experienced with film, with music making, and then just learning about how other people have made things happen. People are often unaware of how close it came to not happening a number of times.
Right.
And so as I speak of the majesty of song, to speak of the majesty of opera might also just be the capacity to make it look like it is what it is. It was not maybe seamless, but just that there it is.
Yeah.
Just like that, right? So I think to have that, to say rock opera and like something like Tommy or The Wall, right? The Wall was conceived of and created, and then the film came out.
Right.
And then when I saw The Wall, Roger Waters' The Wall back in 2014, that is the greatest live show I've ever seen so far in my life.
Wow.
It completely blows away every live performance I've ever seen just because of its scale and its vision. I mean, in the first 3 minutes, a plane crashes into the stage.
Yeah.
That would normally be the climax to an entire production. That was the beginning. So I think that along with what you're saying about legitimizing, I think there's also that that spirit of saying, you know, a bold, passionate vision can be seen and cultivated anywhere.
Yeah.
And so by saying rock opera, like you said, this is a rock opera.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what you say. No, this is a rock opera.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it you know, there's equally there's rap operas, right? You know,
Yes.
like
What is it? Hip opera?
Yeah, hip opera.
Hip opera, I
Yeah.
think. Hip opera.
Yeah.
Hip opera is Beyonce, right? 2001 MTV, they did Carmen.
Yeah.
I think that was the first one. I think. I'm not totally sure. I want to learn more about rap opera.
Season 2, episode 3. It gives us some time to catch up. Yeah. Part of there was almost a desperation in that time period, because Tommy and several other things happened simultaneously in that particular time period that Tommy came out.
Yeah.
This was during that period of the UK that a lot of us didn't like. Do you remember you'd be reading in magazines about Jimmy Page or Eric Clapton or somebody, and they'd always say, "Oh yeah, you know, they met in art school, you know, they met right." And you had this idea, at least I did as a North American, that like, oh yeah, you know, Eric Clapton was an artist, you know, he was in art school, like, isn't that what art school was, you know?
Yeah.
And it seemed like everyone must have been an artist. Wow, how interesting is that? And then I, of course, later learned that there was a sort of a schism in the educational system there, and because there was no employment, they also needed to do something with all the kids that were, you know, 16 to 18 years old.
Yeah.
So they funneled them off to art colleges, which were sort of like these little holding tanks for young adults.
Yeah.
Where, of course, they learned some things, but they weren't all doing art per se.
No,
but
not the romanticized
it's not
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you know, burdened and weighted and already divided into class.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like they weren't upper class people in art college, right? You know, they weren't. This wasn't Cambridge studying art. This was
No, I don't think anyone who went to art college ended up in the civil service. Yeah.
No,
there was a classicism for sure about it.
Absolutely.
At least from my understanding.
So when these guys came out as musicians and became actual artists in that sense, not only were they just fighting still for the title of artist, you know, to be recognized as such, like have this music be recognized as something, you know, they were fighting the whole history and the whole class system that was designed to delegitimize or keep from being legitimized anything that they really did, you know, to keep it within a certain cultural box, right? And so the rock opera was, to me, a revolutionary kick out the jams, kick the doors open,
Right.
seizing of the mantle and the audacity to take the highest form of classical, you know, musical achievement, arguably, and combine it with rock, and say, here we are, you know, and here it is, and deal with this at the same time as the sort of the birth of the album as an album, or birth of the concept album as a thing, and having a new medium for which that to live and find life and distribution in a way that was completely different from how you would experience an opera. You know, I mean, there was something profoundly important happened there in that time period. And, you know, and so the opera pairing or combination with rock was more important in the titling than obviously when you and I encountered it. We didn't have any sort of qualms about, you know, those two things together. But back then it was a very threatening and audacious move to sort of pair those two things up, and it and equally inspired further, right? Inspired more,
Right.
And yet allowed this popular medium that was, you know, meant to stay oppressed in some ways or never ascend, which became the dominant cultural medium, you know, of the, you know, arguably the, you know, from the 60s on, you know, like the latter half or latter third of the, you know, 20th century.
Yeah, because at least for me, so I guess, well, that would be for us, those two, rock and opera together, they're far removed, not only geographically, but I think also culturally, from what you've just outlined very well, which is that rebellion, that push to say, look at this. This is an achievement. It's powerful. It's potent. It's what's also going on right now. And I said in a previous episode about how I was asked if I would write an opera, like when I was going to write an opera.
I remember I've got notes on that I said, but yes, please carry forward.
And I won't relive it right now because I think it's in a previous episode. But just the idea of if I had been asked what's going to be, or when are you going to do your first concept album, right? Like I felt like that question was making so many assumptions about who and what I'm supposed to be, as opposed to just, as opposed to actually asking me, or just, or not even saying, when are you going to do this? Why do you even have to ask that question? And so I think that, along with, as you were saying, you know, that period of time where trying to get out of a box and you make a new one. And that's, since for the most part we're talking about music, that is the history of music, is somebody says, there's nowhere to put this. There's nowhere, like, there's no name for this, but I'm making it. So this is what it is, right? That striving to make what has not been made before. And I think that what comes up for me with rock opera as well is, like I was saying before, I mean, it's a bold undertaking to try and do more when you seem to have less, or you won't have access to more. But on top of that, to break new ground, I think you can't avoid taking old ground along with you. You know, it doesn't sit in a vacuum.
Yeah.
You're always going to upset somebody. You're always going to connect with somebody.
Sure.
But to say, you know, rock opera, and then from that time, like we're talking, you know, the late 60s, by the time I'm hearing what rock opera is, it's less than 20 years later.
Yeah.
And it's not that, you know, the wall's already firmly established and hasn't been around very long. So it wasn't really that odd of an idea. Even the notion of a concept album. I mean, you know, Frank Sinatra did concept albums.
Yeah.
So I wondered too if maybe, like for example, this Debussy.
Yeah.
He did one opera.
Okay.
And it's actually an opera that I really like. And the reason why I like it so much is because his main objectives, some of his main objectives was to undermine the usual operatic devices. Number one, no character has a theme. Gone. Completely gone. Doesn't have a theme. And all of the orchestral music is a background. So the way everything is written and created is that he's making windows for characters to appear in. He's making spaces for them to appear in. But the music and the characters don't have a relationship like they've ever had in opera before. So for some people, that was really striking. But I don't think it's as striking as when rock opera.
Right.
It's a much harder punch, let's say.
Well, can you imagine the discussion? Like
With who?
Whoever.
Okay.
Like back in 1965.
Yeah.
Somebody pitching to somebody, you know, hey, Jimmy, got an idea.
Yeah.
Rock opera. Like, minds are blown. You know, like, you know, and the genesis of that. No, I'm hopefully that's what happened at some point. Although the birth of that, I think, was maybe a little bit different. But just that, yeah, it's one of those explosive opening idea things, right?
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Now, but if you were the the head of the Met in 1960 or in New York or something, or you know, somebody in the UK, whatever their national theater is, and some guy said, Mr. Spencer, you know, whatever, rock opera, you know, like that wouldn't have been explosive.
And it's very interesting you're saying that, because many opera companies now have really blurred the lines to get audience.
Sure.
You know, they'll do West Side Story.
Yeah.
And when I was working for the opera fundraising, and you'd call people who had come to Vancouver Opera's production of West Side Story, some of those people didn't even know that Vancouver Opera did it. Wow. They had no idea. They would say, "Oh yeah, I went to the show, but I had no idea it was Vancouver Opera. I saw West Side Story." Well, would you like to come see opera? No.
Yeah.
And that it would just kind of, sometimes it would end just there. But that thing about Debussy, is that I think that it's happened many times before, and I'm sure it's going to happen again and again. There's these spectrums of, you know, revolution, right? There are some that are really hardcore. Yeah. Some of them that are really, really abrupt, and then some of them are really subtle. So that just as you've talked about that time period of saying rock opera, and when I've looked at, you know, some of the reviews and opinions of that back in the day, often what the criticism was was that it's just not meeting the standard of opera because it's
X,
not
Y,
an
Z,
orchestra, or there's always something that's lacking.
Sure.
But then whenever I'd read those, my response would be, well, that's exactly why you're doing it.
Yeah.
Is to put those things in there so that it does have that rock's aesthetic to it.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is this just needs to work more at being an opera by taking out all the rock.
Yeah, you can't criticize a rock opera for not being an opera. you know, this rock opera thing was working for me, except it's like, but now you just made it an opera. And that's with your criticism, and that's not what it is. It was never supposed to be. I think it was just, although to be fair, I do think Townsend working, and Tommy's a great example because it follows so many conventions.
Yeah.
With overtures and sort of themes that work through the piece and character. It's got narrative, some narrative, sort of talking, singing a little bit, but mostly arias and songs.
It's very strongly character based.
Very, very strongly character based. But there is a lot of convention in there that when you overlay opera and Tommy as a rock opera, it's not too hard to see how opera informed the form that Tommy is, and the structure.
And the wall. The wall has an overture. It has themes running through it. Has character speaking.
Yeah.
First person, singing first person.
And people also like opera itself, the history of opera. It's always been redefining, resisting, and and trying to get back to its roots and then being broken down and
like
and
everything
sort of
else.
Yeah. So like when we say opera, what opera are we talking about? Like because we can problematize that and open that up and really the whole history of even opera. It quickly you can find very similar comparisons to what Debussy tried to do, and there were people doing that at different times in its development, 100 years before, or 200 years before. Like there's this constant cycle of tension and resistance and redefinition and new definition and a return to the original and all complicated by politics.
Neo. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just like so, but from a broader perspective, you get back to that majesty again and sort of seeing like, big important song, saying something, a character saying something, the storytelling through that. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between rock opera and musical theater.
Oh boy.
Which
I think we can only talk about them, but I don't know if we can resolve them.
Yeah. Well, I've got a 3.
Oh, do you?
3-word. I think for those, I think for me, the where rock opera was born and where its home is on the album.
Right.
It lives on an album, whereas musical theater, it may be on an album, but it still lives as a performance on a stage.
That I'm almost with you, but I think that musical theater lives on a page.
Yeah.
But I get what you're saying, and I think
yeah.
and some of the criticisms I read about Tommy back in the day, especially Tommy, was and actually there was one person who said this isn't an opera, it's like a cantata, right? And a cantata is you have vocals and you have small accompaniment, and you have a series of music that is all. So you're right though about living on the album.
Yeah.
Like you can't argue with that, because I think you can't argue against that, because the thing about like something like Tommy and The Wall is that those were created in the studio, and the album becomes that reference point.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas you have an opera, the reference point is actually the score and the libretto, right? Musical theater, right. I think you could put in the same realm. The other thing about opera, though, that was drilled into my mind in my education, is that opera is sung all the way through. I remember for a while, this was a constant coin that was thrown at me at the currency of what an opera is everything is sung.
Which is not true. Well, it depends on what you define, because in the history of opera, I mean, one of the big early turnarounds to try and gather opera unto itself under the name opera was, and to reassert the primacy of the composers and intent, was that opera as theater was starting to be improvised and bastardized by performers, and you had more speaking style singing that was more improvisational and trying to sort of mimic human speech patterns, or and people sort of going off book.
Right. But if they did, it was slight and it would come back. And then as you go through history, if you more and more modern operas just throw those rules out the door.
Yeah, and very specific movements with very specific intents did that at different times, right? And there's, and then you talked earlier about high art versus low art, subject matter. Right. Yeah. And the nature of the story that you're allowed to tell or not tell, and the serious opera versus comic opera, and the tensions between sort of everyday stories and bad behaviors, or body behaviors, that the opera has worn a lot of clothes.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things have been done under the opera umbrella. For me, the commonality still goes back to big.
For sure.
Big,
but now there are modern operas that are very small, right? They're for a number of reasons. But just talking about content of an opera, I remember someone asking me about. They were asking me about like an operatic story. What's it like? And I said, it's kind of like when you decide to walk into the middle of a soap opera. You have to kind of orient yourself very quickly with everything that's gone on before.
Yeah.
This is not to diminish opera by saying soap opera.
Yeah.
But it's there was, earlier operas had this amazing investment in a kind of over-the-top situation.
Well, it's drama versus melodrama, right?
Yeah.
There's and in opera, depending upon where you are historically with it, or what your familiarity with it is, if I asked you if opera was dramatic or melodramatic, you might have a different answer.
Yeah, that's true.
Sometimes it's very melodramatic. It's very soap opera, right?
But just like soap operas, just like a lot of other stories, the story devices are very human. Yeah. And they're very, I don't want to say simple, but they're very clean, the main protagonist dying at the end. Right. Lovers who can't be together. Right. The Oedipus complex. These things that just that would come up again and again, or often that wouldn't be, that would be put into this other like you're saying, other melodrama, and
Sure.
that I used to wonder if that was just to make it seem like it was more than it was. So that was me being very critical and very cynical.
Right.
Was that, oh yeah, you're just inflating all of this story because we all know at the end the soprano's going to die. So you just want to have us have this other sensationalized way for this person to, well, die again because they've been neglected and they've been wronged and I think that maybe as I think about it now, when I was talking about the majesty of song as a connector between rock and opera, maybe the discomfort for some people was that actually it kind of makes sense, but they don't want it to make sense. They're not comfortable with that being a good idea.
Yeah.
Or being a functional idea, where rock as opera, just kind of came to me right now. Because someone's singing on the street corner about how they feel, and then all of this operatic production for this character to sing how they feel. How different is it, really?
Well, the other thing I think that rock opera on albums serves to do is it democratizes. Am I using that correctly?
Maybe.
Do I want to say democratizes or democratizes?
I believe it's democratizes.
Yeah, it democratizes the audience, the listener, right? So in an opera, you go to the opera, you sit in your chair and you watch it.
Yeah.
Right? It's all happening around you. It's all very highly stylized, arguably, not always, but all those efforts have been gone into control and define all those things. Curate.
Yeah.
When you drop the needle on the album, you're generating the visuals based on the music, right?
Yeah.
So you become part of the creation of that.
Mm-hmm.
You're taken into the story, and its ability and your experience is both driving and being driven by the music.
Mm-hmm.
And the visuals that are being created are coming from the passions that are being aroused in you, and also the passions that you're bringing into the moment. And so that to me is a dangerous thing, right? Because that's politically dangerous. When your mind is spinning and imagining story and visuals, it's dangerous. You could think new things. You could think dangerous things. You can draw and connect deviant things.
Plus, you can have easier access to an album than you have. You even said it earlier on that it's not something that you can afford right now. To go to the opera.
Yeah.
But you're far more likely to afford listening to music, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
so there's that other piece.
But that, to bring you as a listener into the experience of the thing you're listening to, where you're as like co-creating it at the same time with majesty on the line at that level of big story.
Well, but maybe I agree with you. But I think also at the same time, going to a show is co-creator. So I might be picking, I might be being a little highly picky on it. But what you're conveying to me, I think, is that, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that visual component, you're able to go, it isn't so, it's like a film, for example. This is what it looked like. This is what, actually what we're talking about is something that I have issue with adaptations. Like I'm very, very, very picky about going to see an adaptation of anything. For a number of reasons. But one of the things for me is that, for example, if there's a book that I have a very, very close relationship with, it takes a lot for me to watch a movie that's been adapted of the book, because I want to be a custodian of that experience.
Yeah.
So I agree with you about how having a rock opera on an album, there is a freedom of experience with it because of what you referred to as co-creation. And the one way that I voiced it once when I was asked about this is I said, well, one book has millions of films. It's just that they've all been different and happened in individual minds.
Right.
So I'm with you on that. I
Right.
really am. And I think that the one thing too that came up for me when I was working at the opera was that idea of control, right? Which is something that I went through when I was into filmmaking. I want to have, I didn't call it that at the time in my mind, but I wanted control over what people see. Right? It's not the same as if you read a sentence. You can make it anything you want. A young woman walking down the street at night. Like, you say that to a room full of people, they all have a different film or a different visual experience that's going on.
Right. Well, and when you read or write a screenplay, you'll meet people that will be very critical if you're anything but completely dry.
Yeah,
like with no descriptors. Where you read a Tarantino screenplay, he's all but got the camera angle as part of the descriptor, and it's a fully realized vision. Sort of like in terms of the directions that are given within the screenplay or the descriptors or the qualifiers. So like there's those two schools.
Which brings to mind something for me in terms of rock opera versus opera. Whereas when you put on an opera, you have an art director, you have costume, you have these different departments. But as you're saying, a rock opera exists on an album. In a way, those musicians have pretty much stamped a certain kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess control maybe isn't the right word, but they've said, no, this is what it is. In a way, like it's Tommy by The Who, right? It's The Wall by Pink Floyd. Whereas when you talk about opera, especially operas that have gone the distance, Verdi's opera, Verdi's not around,
right,
to say, okay, this is what it's got to sound like. Even technically, like I said, you have the page, right? So there isn't a defining, like the Marriage of Figaro. It wasn't recorded back in the day when Mozart was there doing all his conducting and overseeing all of it. So there isn't that, okay, this is what it has to sound like. Whereas with a recording, like, this is what it has to sound like. Now, of course, we can argue the staging and the visuals and what will happen with that. But I wonder what you think about that. Like, do you think that rock opera is maybe more autonomous? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's not just saying it's an achievement, but it's like we've achieved this, and you can't really touch it because we set a bar. Like, we've recorded it. This is what it's supposed to sound like. This is the mood of it.
Right.
What do you think about that?
A good question, right? Because you're right. Whether it's a symphony or an opera, they get staged, right? Somebody puts them on. Somebody, gathers the orchestra, and a conductor determines, what and how they're going to play something. In the opera's case, there's a whole lot of creative people involved, unified maybe under a larger creative vision. But that vision is not resisted by anything, right? Other than maybe tradition, it's what has gone before. Now it could be with a rock opera. We just haven't had enough time.
That is a very good point,
right?
Yeah.
Because what we're seeing now is we are seeing people re-recording other people's albums.
Yes.
And we're seeing that, when we first saw it, we saw people recording classic albums, re-recording, an album from 30 years ago or deep in the timeline of the canon. Now we're seeing people re-recording albums by artists that are only like 3 or 4 years old. I'm going to record Taylor Swift's album, and that was released 4 years ago. And so if I imagine what's going to happen in the future, are we if the first guy to try and re-record Dark Side of the Moon,
well, it has been done.
Yeah.
Dubside
had a lot of scrutiny though, right? And
I don't know what the scrutiny was.
I'm going to say that not having heard it, the scrutiny would be me with my arms folded. Let me hear that.
Well, I will tell you right now,
yeah,
that I have listened to Dub Side of the Moon many times.
Okay.
And I have no problem saying that I actually thought at times that it was a reggae album first.
Okay.
It's so good.
Very, very cool.
But it's not the original, of course.
No.
But it is really good.
Right. And reggae is also one of those privileged forms of music that is actually untouchable and unable to be criticized. Like it's sort of...
I don't know what you mean by that.
It's universally loved. I love reggae.
Really?
Is
it really universally loved?
In the sense that reggae is reggae, and anyone outside of the tradition of reggae that tries to criticize reggae, I don't think they're permitted.
Okay, so maybe you have a point, because I've heard a bluegrass version of Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work for me.
It didn't work for you. Yeah.
It doesn't work for me. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I say this with a lot of humor, of course. Humor is intended at humor. But yeah, I just mean as more and more people, try to recreate classic albums or try to re-record stuff. There is that question of are you trying, as they get different iterations or different perspectives on it or different twists or different turns. That's kind of what we're all about right now, right? Nobody can do a straight cover anymore. They've got to put a spin on it, and it's got to be very, more and more energy going into crafting the perfect spin or the most unique spin on something than it is actually sort of going into the song itself. Why are you doing this song?
So you mean, would you like Johnny Cash doing Pain by Nine Inch Nails, and
I'm more talking about like an album, like a cover album.
Okay.
Right. Not just individual. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Not just songs. No.
Right. Because we are seeing a lot of the covering of other songs.
Yeah.
Because it's supposedly a great vehicle for people to notice you and get a lot more clicks.
Well, and today too, and it's no small. If you look at the guy from Pamplemousse that founded Patreon,
right?
He also founded a distribution company, Sounddrop, who specialized initially in cover versions.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So for my stuff, the cover that I released, the Sense of Anarchy cover, I released through Sounddrop because they handled all the licensing. That the other distributors weren't into cover song licensing yet, right?
Right.
But his whole Scary Pockets and Pamplemousse and stuff, I mean, they built their whole thing on the backs of cover songs. So interesting to see that a guy who's on the nose of tech and on the nose of that kind of stuff, seeing the demand for cover distribution of covers being like really a monetary sort of good vehicle to get behind. So yeah, I think covers we're just going to see tons more.
Well, I mean, I don't know much about that. I've just been watching what's been going on with YouTube.
Yeah.
And people monetizing and copyright infringement, and it's the tech has certainly brought up a lot of those issues, and I think they're still trying. They're trying to be resolved. But usually, what happens is that it's those who already are in a place of having the means to, because it's not YouTube that goes through and finds who's infringing on a copyright. The people who actually created that music, they're the ones, or the production companies are the ones who actually put in the time and the effort to find those things. It just so happens that it's on YouTube, but it's really those people who've either produced it or created it that are the ones who have to do that work.
It's twofold now.
Invest in that.
There are actual boiler rooms full of people working for music publishers and record
music
people,
publishers. That's what I want.
that are going through individually and trying to find videos that have infringed, that they can steal the monetization off of back to themselves, right? Where they're actively going out and searching for anybody who's got a popular video. It's like if we had the TV on in the background here and a little bit of some theme song was playing.
We would be asked.
Yeah.
Are you going to pull that out? Are you going to give us some royalties or what?
Are you going to give up all of this lucrative podcast money to
Well, I'd like to have a coffee at the end of the year.
Yeah, well, I think we might, if we look for bottles on the way to recording sessions. I wanted to ask you, any conversations about concept albums. I mean, there's tons of them out there, and there's great conversations to be had about what the different genres or subgenres of rock operas, and as part of a part of the overall arc of everything that we're talking about here. But outside of spending hours talking about individual albums and individual rock operas, I mean, we've mentioned a few. We've mentioned Tommy. We've mentioned The Wall.
Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yeah. There's others that a favorite of mine, relatively new and not relatively recent, was Southern Rock Opera by the Drive-By Truckers, which I thought was kind of a neat thing. When I heard the title, Southern Rock Opera, that was I knew what it was going to be just from the title, and it's like, I got to check that one out. I think it was is it Pattison Hood, or what's his name?
I don't remember.
Yeah, I'm really bad.
I haven't heard it. I've just heard of it.
He was interviewed on Marin, I think, at one point, and that's where they were talking about it.
Oh, okay.
And that's where I was like, oh, I got to check that out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't heard it. Just heard of it.
Yeah, it's really cool. But there's tons of stuff out there. Do you have rock other than, of course, our last conversation, or one of our last conversations? You mentioned 2112, right? Which you could say is rock opera or space opera. which is a version.
Is that your question?
Well, I mean, yeah, 2112 to me is rock opera, but it's also, I've heard it described as space opera.
Yeah.
And but where does that sit for you now?
2112?
Yeah, in relationship to a rock opera, or the idea of a rock opera to you.
Well, I think there's a very valid argument for it being called a rock opera because character speaks, right? So I'm okay with the designation that a rock opera is about character, and character singing their triumphs, their woes, their revelations, their riddles, all of that. So I would say, yeah, it is a rock opera, but it's a short one.
Yeah.
Is it a space opera? Sure, because it's futuristic. Maybe more it's a sci-fi opera, because from all I can see is that I get from the whole thing is that they're on the Earth. So it's more sci-fi than space, if I want to get really, really, really picky.
Right. It's not Flash Gordon.
Flash Gordon. No, it's not Flash Gordon. But you could also call it, is it a sci-fi dystopian opera? Mm-hmm. Right?
Nice.
So, we're coming into this beautiful place that humanity has just loved to get our hands into, which is semantics, right? And so your question of what it is to me is probably most valid only at this moment, because maybe in 10 minutes I might change my mind, or there might be another way to refer to it.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, space opera made most sense because, of course, there was like sort of space on the cover of the album.
Oh man.
Yeah. So I mean, right there, that was very defining for me.
You're going to turn this into a real fisticuffs. Well, we just talked about 2112, which and I've still been in a nostalgia place with it,
right?
Which has been really nice.
Well, then let me just take one step to the left on that.
Okay.
I read somebody describing Hemispheres as a rock opera. Because this problematizes character a little bit, right? There's so much.
No, because Dionysius speaks for itself.
Yeah. I mean,
and so does Apollo.
Okay.
There's moments where they speak. Well, and actually, Hemispheres is really interesting because it is problematic only if we really need to define it and really give it a label. Right. Because really, if you came up to me and you said hemispheres, that is the first thing I'm going to think about. I'm not going to think about the Earth. I'm not going to think about hemispheres of the brain, although that's what hemispheres really gets into.
Yeah.
I'm going to think Rush hemispheres.
Right.
I'm going to be there.
Yeah.
So I think you've just opened up another area of discussion, which is language. Right?
Okay.
And so I don't know how far down that hole we want to go right now, but I think it's valid in terms of talking about, because we've been talking about rock opera, right? Even the word rock, right? That was the other question I was thinking of asking you, but this is not going to be a 6-hour podcast.
Well, that's the thing.
What do you think of when I say rock?
Yeah, I think what's important to know is that, like in any discussion that we can have, you can quickly open the door to like hours of additional discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And, there are people that will be sitting at their kitchen table, and what they'll be doing over the weekend, at any given weekend somewhere, is they will be having impassioned debates about what albums in the rock canon or musical canon are rock operas. Or
I think that's just you and me.
No, I'm pretty.
I don't know how many people are actually doing that.
Well, I don't think I like to think there's people doing that. Like the reading I've done online, there does seem to be a lot of people they like to debate.
Yeah.
Those things within individual albums that make them a certain category or a certain thing.
Yeah, and maybe I should just own up and say how can I put this? Even after we've had all this conversation, I don't invest myself that deeply into those kinds of debates.
Yeah,
I don't.
It's a different way
yeah.
to it's a different way to maybe explore something, right?
Yeah,
About that,
that's
and
true.
it might illuminate your understanding of something from a different perspective as you go through that debate process. But like you, I'm not that interested in making a master list or debating who should be on it or
Yeah.
for me there I definitely like the sort of the bigger picture stuff and some of the sort of historical stuff that comes to how things are birthed and how we get them.
Yeah, and the experience of them.
Yeah.
Because I take your question about 2112 in that spirit.
Yeah.
It's like, what was your experience of it? And so now that I've just said that, it comes to me that considering 2112 a short sci-fi opera is a very valid one for me, because I've always loved sci-fi.
Yeah.
And calling it a rock opera, sci-fi opera, I have to admit, dystopian sci-fi opera.
Sci-fi.
I have to admit that there is kind of a little bit of a juice in that, right? Because it touches, it goes to that nostalgia I was speaking of, where I was very transported by my first and then every other listening I've had of that particular side of that album.
Right.
But yeah, and I think I said it the last time. It's so well crafted. Like I said, I'm still in a very warm, nostalgic place with it.
Yeah. The one thing that did surprise me as I read through lists of rock operas and the internet is full of these kinds of lists.
Yeah. 10 best
or 50 best or 100 greatest rock operas, is how many new things I've not heard before. How many and how many new works are part of those lists. So it's exciting to think that in this streaming world where people's musical attention and their ability to listen to song or experience song seems to be much more truncated in terms of accessible time for them, and also medium, that there are people out there that are creating albums that are enough to be considered a rock opera, and that there are people that seemingly have the time to experience them as a rock opera or some methodology. Now I could query that and say, yeah, but is this kind of like the thing where you talk about the thing you've never listened to and you call it a something because somebody else called it a something? Like,
oh, you mean like people have great works of literature on their shelves but they've never read them?
Yeah, and they could give you the top 100 books of all times, and they've not read them, or like, I don't know. I want to be optimistic and encouraged by such robust lists full of new albums and new music.
Yeah,
but I don't see or know people listening to music in that way.
Aside from you and I.
Aside from
and a couple other people I know.
A couple other people. Although there is evidence, you've got this vinyl right here, right?
Yeah.
That exists as vinyl, and as an opportunity to listen to it as vinyl. So it has a life somehow.
Yeah.
But I'm not for the. I look at what people talk about concept albums, and what people talk about something like a rock opera, or if they talk about like a Beyonce album or Rihanna album, the press on that is about single streams of specific songs, and although they title it as a concept album I'm just not sure people are listening to it as an album.
with what you're saying right now, I'm compelled to say something that I'm not sure if I've mentioned it already before in a previous podcast, is that a few years ago, I came to the decision that if I'm going to keep doing what I need to do, I need to be at peace with the idea that I'm stoking fires the heat of which I cannot feel.
Okay.
So what I hear from you right now, tell me if I'm wrong,
Sure.
is that what's being put out there is not being heard or heard the way it was maybe intended, right? So you talked a bit, you brought it up very well about rock opera, that term to legitimize the endeavor, whatever it is, of whatever album or concept that a musician, an artist wanted to create. And I think that one of the things right now about where we are with the dissemination of music, it's not in accordance with what I feel in myself, how I would like to experience music with other people. So what I have found is that I just do the work and I put it out there, and I put it out there in ways that I feel are as close to how I feel I can care for the work, if that makes sense. And then it'll go wherever it goes and it'll do whatever it does. And that's what I mean about stoking fires.
Sure.
And I can't feel the heat of those fires.
Yeah.
So the idea of creating, a large scale work and then putting it out there, I could see how some people would say it's just not going to be heard. And my argument is you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, I can't do the numbers with you. I can't do the probabilistic numbers to say that, yeah, you know what? You're going to make this album, you're going to put it out there, and you might as well just put it in the ocean.
Sure.
I can't argue that, because I think the only way that you can argue that is if you actually think you can control and completely understand phenomena to go down that road a little bit. I have had enough evidence in my life that the person who has undermined my work more than anyone else has been me. And the way that I've done that is, first of all, I think I know what's going to happen. I don't. And when the first podcast we did about a concept album, and we brought up the idea of, why would you do a concept album?
Yeah.
And I think that just as we're talking about rock opera and legitimizing that undertaking, that has to come from inside a person or a few individuals to make something come into the world that they haven't seen. And quite often that means that you are being rebellious. You are being, you're disturbing the status quo. But you're already feeling it inside. There was a friend of mine many years ago who was telling me about going to the art gallery, and for the first time, paintings by Monet. I can't remember what gallery they're at. And they said they couldn't believe how beautiful it was. It brought them to tears. And then we started talking about just art making and artists. And I had said, most people tend to be concerned about art than the artists. I said, what do you mean? I said, I love Monet. I said, no, you don't. What do you mean I don't love Monet? I just told you I love the paintings. Yeah, you love the paintings. You don't know Monet. You don't know what Monet was like. You didn't have to sit with Monet. You didn't sit with Monet when things weren't going well. You have no idea what you're talking about. So you go into the gallery and you see Monet, and you had this amazing experience, and that's beautiful. And that is a big piece of art making, I think, and sharing our views and our work. But can you imagine what Monet would feel like if seeing all of those images inside themselves and never bringing them out. Can you imagine what that would feel like? And she got it.
Yeah.
She said, that must be terrible. Exactly. So I'm the first one to say to somebody, if you need to create something, do it.
Yeah.
And if I start hearing reasons why not, 99% of the time, those reasons are about their theories about how the world's going to receive it.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, I'm with you on right now how music and creation is being disseminated. It's very different than it was when we were kids.
Yeah.
And
even young adults.
And maybe I sound like an old man, and I'm going out to pasture, but I don't think the hurdles have changed. They're still there. They've always been there. They're just different.
Right.
None of those hurdles are reason not to, because nothing is like the moment when it comes out.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I spoke about the majesty of song, because there's nothing like singing anytime. I don't care. You're in the bathroom, you're in the shower, you're on the bus. It doesn't matter. It just feels amazing. Do it.
Yeah.
Right? So the whole thing, again, I've said it a couple times, but it's worth mentioning. You really characterize it well, of that era of rock opera being spoken as a way to legitimize. But I wonder even if the term rock opera came up first. You had mentioned, think about listening to this, Jimmy, rock opera. Well, that feeling to make this thing, it probably didn't have a name like that. It came first, So I think that what you're saying about, all these new rock operas or concept albums coming out and maybe not getting the same listen to as maybe we were accustomed to when we were younger or later on. It's different, but it's okay.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. For me, there is that sort of intellectual curiosity as you kind of mull questions over.
Yeah.
But the point that I must remember and take away from that is that still look how many things are on these lists that you've not heard and not found, and it doesn't matter. I mean, it's a little small discussion to talk about the communal experience of a collective community of people that listen to experience a piece of work. That's an interesting discussion, but outside of all those other people, I have the opportunity to go and search any one of those out and listen to them. Yeah. And that's enough, to still have that opportunity.
You'll never know how what you've done has affected somebody. And it's not because it's in the hands of some corporate execs or some platform's algorithms. It might also just be that the person who listened to it is not able to voice how they feel, but they still feel it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's exciting to sort of take something that you could perceive in a negative way and bemoan the changes or the loss of opportunity or commonality of how things like that are discovered and consumed and sort of taken into the culture. But just the fact that there's people obviously still creating, and that if anything, there's more people. I think quite quantifiably more people creating stuff as technology and the means of production and barriers of entry have eroded. There's a lot of people making things right now. Yeah, making albums.
And I don't think that your question was a bemoaning at all. Like I think that you're bringing up a really beautiful perspective, You're saying, look at this. And as more people have the opportunity to have access to the tech, to have access to the means of production, let's say, there are still those who don't. I'm certainly not saying that everyone's got it.
Yeah.
But what I find really interesting is I've gotten to know more and more people who, like me, have their home studios, and I've seen them get better at it. I've seen them overcome production issues, creative issues, personal issues, and create the work. And I've seen many times that radiance from them of like, yeah, I did that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did that. And it was hard. It was amazing. It's like, it's the glistening sweat of the athlete after they ran the hardest race of their life, or they achieved some milestone in their own lives, that you can see the sweat, but you can see from within them that it's not like there's an energy in a life there that wasn't there before, or is personified in those moments.
Right.
And I think that when we talk about sitting down listening to an album, and how there's the journey, concept albums is that journey, and how you and I both talked about what's going to happen for us by having these conversations about music. I know that for myself, I'm tired after we have these conversations, but it's the next morning where I'm like, yeah, keep going. And because I've created the things I've created, it informs these conversations.
Sure.
And it goes back and forth, right? So having those lists of 100 greatest albums, and that, you're right, I may not entertain those, invest myself in those things, but for some people, they need it, they want it, it's helpful, and I think that's the other thing that I would hope to see more of with the tech that we have, not only in terms of creativity, but also in people's interactions, and what they do through the internet and what have you, and hopefully more personally, is that there's more conversations, and that there's the nuance of those conversations. And then my other favorite thing is time for reflection, and that's the other thing I really feel like I benefit from these conversations, is that I reflect on them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's there's like the conversation, and then there's the conversation that you replay. Yeah. and you converse within it, like you're actually, so I go away and and re-engage midstream to things we've been talking about, as if I'm now the third party in that conversation after the fact. Only the two other guys I'm talking to, you and me, we don't have the ability to say anything different. So that my new self in that moment is engaged by it, and sort of continuing it, and coloring it, and getting excited by it. The one thing I realize, and as I again look at all those lists, and my initial thoughts were first sort of like, oh, if only someone would be able to spin Tommy 700 times. Like, I probably listened to Tommy 700 times, right? And then I realized that not only am I not going to be able to listen to all those ones on those lists, I'm probably not going to be able to listen to any of them the way I listened to Tommy, when I encountered it, and with the repetitions of spin, and as our time on the planet is finite. I'm now looking at the books I have and have read, and realizing that there's a lot of books in the world that I want to read that I won't be able to read because I'm not going to have time to read them all, and there's a lot of music out there that I'm not going to be able to hear, but there's enough of us, I think, on the planet that if somebody's making music, somebody can be listening to it. And so, I just got to smile that there's other realities and other people in their place and time that are experiencing basically the same, their own thing.
Yeah, and I think that there's a beautiful place to occupy when you're at peace with, well, not everything is for me,
Yeah.
and that's not an ego jab. That's like I was talking about stoking fires.
Yeah.
It's also like, okay, those fires are not for me.
Yeah.
And you can't
Well,
force it all in.
Some of them aren't for you, but also some of them you're just not going to get to.
Well, isn't that's kind of the same thing?
I guess, yeah.
I guess it depends on how you want to describe it phenomenologically.
Yes. Oh, pulls out a nice one. That's good.
Well,
3 points.
I'm getting maybe I'm getting testy now.
That was good. I like that.
So,
we're
I guess we're going to probably do rock opera again.
Yeah.
At some point.
Well, I certainly rock opera is part of the concept album genre.
Yeah.
And we will be engaged or re-engaged with it in some capacity through some discussions. Like so many of these discussions are, there's several tangent points at any place and time in them that could connect to additional discussions or have addendums or so
appendix.
Yeah, appendix. Yeah. Where they're so there's definitely we're not done with rock operas. We're by any means,
because we're certainly going to be talking about a few of them.
Yeah, and I think we're as we sort of naturally close out our conversation here. We don't know exactly what the next conversation will be, but we do know that some of them will be more specific looks at specific works and specific things and talking about things and so some rock operas may return.
We'll probably have to talk about opera again too. Like that's going to come up. I mean, talk about a large topic, and then rock.
Well, yeah, and musical theater was an interesting one. Especially contemporary musical theater. We I think this is the second podcast we've mentioned West Side Story in.
I don't know. Maybe
I think it's come up. Not. I may have mentioned it.
Well, then I'm sure it'll be mentioned again.
Yeah, but there's lots of interesting things to discuss there. But do you have anything contemporary rock opera wise that rolls?
American Idiot.
Yeah.
American Idiot, and that's all I got right now.
Yeah, I've got American Idiot. I talked about Southern rock opera, but also I really enjoyed My Chemical Romance.
Of course,
yes. Which
that was about suicide, isn't it?
I think it's about a patient, cancer patient.
Yes, cancer patient. That's it. Not suicide, cancer. Yeah, My Chemical Romance. Yeah.
Yeah, but suicide in a way.
I can't pull up my list right now.
No, and
but we'll get to them.
We'll get to them for sure. But great.
That was good.
Yeah, good conversation. Would love to, like always, sometimes pause and then redo the same conversation again, just to
you got to stoke those unknown fires, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let it go.
Birth it and let it go out into the wild.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, funny. This was good fun, and we've had whether people are hearing this part of our conversation or not, it's been an interesting one on the technical side.
Yeah.
And we've had a few events that were funny and I think
real
and very real. And you may or may not hear them. Hopefully, but again, in the spirit of the conversations, like that's as always, I appreciate it.
Yeah, me as well.
Really enjoyed it there. It was highlight of the week for sure.
Absolutely, and looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely, thanks, man.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, Joël.